Guys, this is one of those handful of cases I absolutely dread the most because it's terrifying and allegedly this one has it all. Murders committed against young couples in love. Every new moon, a new body. Planted evidence, secret societies, a cover-up reaching to the top. Black masses, occult rituals, satanic elite circles, a magician, and a fake body found in a lake. Dozens of dead witnesses, a botched investigation, and 50 years later, this case still remains unsolved and haunts Italy. This is one of those stories that stays with you for the rest of your life, and we're going to get into it all. So buckle up, because this is a wild one. Welcome back to Deep, Dark, and Scary. My name is Jenny, and thank you so much for watching. Here we explore unsolved true crime cases, mysterious disappearances, tragic deaths, and stories of survival. Please subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Warning: this story contains content that may be distressing for some listeners. Florence, one of the most romantic cities in the world, a place of pasta and truffles, Tuscan wine and Renaissance art, home to Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and Botticelli, castles, rolling hills, and timeless beauty. But in the early 1980s, Romans had a curfew. Desire had rules. Italy was still clinging to tradition, deeply Catholic, conservative, and where premarital acts meant sin, and shame followed close behind. So young couples who wanted to be intimate had to slip away, to the forests and hills, to the olive groves, in the dark of night. They were looking for privacy, but what they found instead, or should I rather say who found them instead, was a serial predator. June 6, 1981. A warm summer morning, an off-duty policeman is driving the back roads near Scandicci, just outside of Florence. He sees a parked car, unusual at that hour. What he finds inside will haunt him for the rest of his life. Two bodies, a man and a woman. At first glance, the male appears to be sleeping, his head gently resting against the driver's window. But the glass is shattered, his face ghostly pale, and there's a small black hole in his temple. Forensic pathologist Dr. Giovanni Morello is called to the scene. The victims have both been shot, multiple times, then stabbed repeatedly. The women's injuries are worse, far worse. Journalist Mario Spezzi is one of the first to arrive. I saw the guy in the car. He looked like he was sleeping, but her, I can't even describe it. Chief Inspector Ruggero Perugini leads the investigation. He's meticulous, cold, and haunted already. In old interviews, he said, every detail matters. What's there, what's missing, the pattern, the rage. The victims were identified as 21-year-old Carmela Di Nuccio, a shop assistant, and a 30-year-old boyfriend Giovanni Foggi, who worked as a warehouseman. They had danced at a local disco that night, before driving up into the hills for a private, intimate moment. But the killer was already there, or had followed them. Waited. And then the killer did something indescribable. Carmela was pulled out of the car and, let me put this in a YouTube-friendly way, but with surgical precision, her lower private area was cut and parts of her body were taken. It was so gruesome that it made some of the officers believe that this was actually the killer's real objective. Investigators working on the case said it wasn't really done out of rage, but maybe to leave a mark or a message. The Carabinieri, Italy's national police, search for motive continued. Jealousy, revenge, nothing really fit. The couple had no enemies, no history of issues with anyone. There were just no apparent reasons for their undoing, or the brutality. As investigators processed the 1981 crime scene, one detail kept pulling them backward. The setting, the isolation, the fact that the couple was alone in a parked car, far from anyone's view. It reminded one of the officers of a case from 7 years earlier, one that had never been solved. On September 15, 1974, just north of Florence, two teenagers were found brutally murdered in their car by a local farmer. 19-year-old barman Pascal Gentilcore and 18-year-old accountant Stefania Pettini had driven to the countryside for some privacy and never came back. They were not far from a notorious discotheque where they were supposed to spend the evening with friends. But instead, they were shot and stabbed in a country lane near Borgo San Lorenzo. While being intimate in Pascal's Fiat, Stefania's injuries were even more disturbing. 97 stab wounds focused around the lower abdomen and the left side of her chest, Her body also had been violated with a grapevine branch. It was targeted and grotesque. The veracity of the attack suggested that there might have been more than one attacker. Hours before the murder, Stefania had disclosed to a close friend that a weird man was terrifying her. Another friend of Stefania recalled a strange man had followed and bothered them during a driving lesson just a few days before. But again, there was no real motive, no robbery, no known enemies or issues in their lives, just a pattern of cruelty, especially toward the female victim. Back in 1981, that pattern raised alarms. Were these cases connected? Two couples, both attacked in parked cars, both in isolated rural spots, and both marked by excessive post-mortem violence towards the woman. For the first time, investigators began to consider this might not be a one-off crime and offender. It might be a series perpetrated by the same killer. And were there any other victims that they didn't know about yet? As panic spread, police made their first major move. They arrested a local man, 30-year-old night watchman Enzo Spalletti. He allegedly spoke about the murders the very next morning before the bodies were even discovered. Spalletti was a known figure in the area, allegedly a known voyeur, rumored to lurk around and watch couples in parked cars, basically a peeping Tom, and the story went like this. Spalletti had been caught spying on couples making out. He panicked and then killed them to cover it up. To many, it seemed plausible. Not a serial killer, just a perverse man who lost control here and there. Within days, he was arrested and held for 3 months. The city exhaled. People felt safer. But the relief would be short-lived because within months, another couple would be found dead. And this time during Spalletti's time in custody, which made the police question the earlier arrest. Was Enzo Spalletti the real killer, or was it a false arrest to calm the town? But just weeks later, that theory collapsed. The next murder would exonerate him completely, proving the real killer was still out there. Another young couple spends an evening out. They go to the movies, then drive to a quiet spot just outside of Florence. They think they are alone, but as you already know, they are not. In the morning, both are found dead in a park in the vicinity of Calenzano. On the 23rd of October 1981, the 26-year-old Stefano Baldi, a workman, was shot, and his fiancée, 24-year-old Susanna Cambi, a telephonist, was dragged from the car, shot, stabbed, and desecrated in a private area, a manner reminiscent of the Denuccio murder. The morning after, an anonymous caller phoned Susanna's mother, asking to talk to her about her daughter. And a few days before the crime, Susanna had confided to her mother that someone was tormenting her and had even chased her with a car. The couple was engaged, but killed a month before they were supposed to get married. They never stood a chance. Investigators are shaken, once again. The violence is familiar, but worse. The injuries on the woman, more extreme. One officer would later say, "You couldn't help but notice the beauty of her face." And then the horror of what had been done to her. To the Carabinieri, it's clear now Spalletti is innocent. After 3 months in custody, he's released without charge. A humiliating setback for them. And the damage was already done. The investigation is back at zero, and they got 2 more victims. But at the crime scene, something was left behind. Police find spent shell casings. They sent them for analysis. Ballistic experts make a breakthrough. In interviews, Francesco Donato, head of Tuscany's forensic lab, confirmed it. The bullets from all 3 crime scenes, 1974, 1981, and now, involve the same ammunition. .22 caliber bullets that had been fired from the same weapon, most likely a Beretta. The cartridge cases carry a telltale H on the base, the Winchester head stamp, same type, same weapon, and same method. For the first time, police say it out loud. This is a serial killer, one man with a specific weapon. And these murders weren't just about killing. It was about leaving a mark. He wanted people to know it was him, one investigator said. Florence descends into fear. No one is asking anymore if the killer will strike again. The question now was when. 3 couples murdered in the quiet hills around Florence. 7 years have passed since the first attack in 1974. And still, no arrests and no answers. All investigators had were more questions, case after case. And the Carabinieri were running out of leads. And the paper's journalist, Mario Spezzi, who followed the case from the beginning, starts calling the killer something new. The Monster of Florence. And even hardened journalists hesitate to print the details of the chilling pattern that emerges. Precise post-mortem injuries to the female victim's intimate areas, and removal of parts. Anyone investigating, involved, or reporting about the case felt it. It wasn't just the horror or the brutality itself, it was the intimacy of it. The people of Florence are terrified. Rumors, whispers, and fear become accusations. Wives point to husbands, mothers to sons, friends to former lovers. Everyone at that point was a suspect, and no one felt safe. The police, meanwhile, are paralyzed. Even basic procedures are breaking down. The crime scenes are in rural areas and are usually discovered by hikers, farmers, or local passerbys. And by the time authorities arrive, it's almost always too late. Evidence contaminated. Especially back then, officers didn't wear gloves, shoe covers, or protective suits. People wander through bloodstains, and journalists or curious onlookers leave behind footprints. Forensics in the 1980s Italy is still in its early days, and unfortunately, as we know today, that damage is irreversible. But even with the given tools, investigators begin to see a pattern in the killer's method. He approaches the car slowly, then, suddenly, floods the interior with a flashlight or headlamp. The effect is blinding to the couple inside, like deers caught in headlights. That's when he fires, always the male first. Then he drags the female from the car, takes his time, and does the unthinkable. To many, it looks like he's staking a claim, removing her from the man asserting power, possession, giving the level of surgical procedure. Some believe the killer has surgical knowledge. A gynecologist maybe, a butcher, a hunter, someone very comfortable with a blade. But even with that theory, the motive remains unclear. Why these couples? Why the ritualistic violence? Why target the women in this way? No one knows. But one thing is for certain. To stop this killer, they'll need to understand his mind. But time is running out. And within months, the Monster of Florence would strike again. On June 19, 1982, 22-year-old mechanic Paolo Mainardi and 20-year-old dressmaker Antonella Migliorini had gone to the movies, then driven to the outskirts of town for privacy. They were childhood sweethearts. But on a narrow country road in Montespertoli, just outside Florence, someone was watching. Drivers report what looks like a car accident. A small vehicle stopped at an odd angle. An ambulance is dispatched. Lorenzo Allegranti is first on the scene. But the moment he arrives, he realizes this is no accident. Inside the car are two victims. Antonella is already dead, no chance of revival. Her boyfriend Paolo is lying on the back seat. Still breathing, barely alive, barely conscious. Lorenzo Allegranti later recalled rushing to Paolo's side, hoping to stabilize him long enough for police to speak with him. In an interview, he says, "I wanted to be very fast. There was still hope that we could save him, and that maybe he could lead us to the killer." This time, something had gone wrong for the monster. According to investigators, Antonella and Paolo had just finished making love in Paolo's Fiat when he must have heard something, or noticed someone move in the dark. Paolo likely saw the attacker approaching. He quickly started the engine, threw the car in reverse, and tried to escape. But moments later, the vehicle veered off the road and crashed into a ditch on the opposite side. Some investigators believe Paolo lost control in the panic. Trapped, he had nowhere to go. The killer stayed calm, eerily calm, and reacted with chilling precision. Deliberately, he shot out the headlights of the car, then fired through the windshield. Others suggest the killer may have moved the car himself, trying to hide the bodies in the nearby woods before abandoning it, where it was later discovered by a passing motorist. But this time something was missing. Unlike the previous attacks, the monster did not do anything to the female victim's body. The couple's car was parked along a relatively busy stretch of road, closer to the village than all the previous victims. A considerable risk for the killer. Several passing motorists reported seeing the parked car illuminated from within when the cabin light came on. Before completing the ritual fearing exposure, the killer must have fled into the night. The monster didn't realize it in the moment, but this would be the first real mistake. For the first time, he had left a witness alive. Paolo was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. But back at the hospital, Paolo was dying. He had survived the monster's attack, barely, but only for a short time. And in those hours between life and death, the police was waiting outside the hospital room, with desperate hope that he might wake up and speak, might be able to identify the killer. But he never did. Hours later, just after 4 a.m., Paolo dies from his injuries. He never regains consciousness, and whatever he saw that night and the identity of the killer dies with him. It's a devastating blow to the investigation, but the Carabinieri see an opening. What if the killer thinks Paolo did say something? The next day, investigators call Mario Spezzi, the journalist. They ask him to deliberately run a false story to newspapers, suggesting Paolo had regained consciousness and said something before dying, hoping to flush out the killer. It's a trap. If the killer reads it, maybe he'll panic, slip up, reach out. Days later, the ambulance driver, Lorenzo Allegranti, is woken at night by a phone call. What did Minardi say? Lorenzo answers, "Who is this?" It's the Monster of Florence. The voice warns Allegranti to be careful, then hangs up. Dozen more calls follow. Some of them threaten his life, others his family. "Watch what you say. Be careful about your family. You're a dead man." The voice on the other end never identified himself. But the message was always the same, threatening, erratic, and cold. The monster had spoken. Allegranti is placed under police protection, and the investigators knew he would strike again. The trap had worked, or so they thought, at least partially. The killer had taken the bait, but he was still out there, watching the investigations and hunt for him unfold. Then, just when the case appears stalled again, a new lead arrives. Not through a tip line, but in the form of an anonymous letter. Inside a single line, "Why haven't you looked into the murder from 1968? Signed by a friendly citizen. Investigators dig into archives, and with that, the investigation takes a sharp, unexpected turn. 14 years earlier, on the night of the 21st of August, 1968, just outside Florence, a couple was found shot dead in their car. But was this another Lover's Lane murder? It does fit the same setting, staging, and weapon. The victims were the 32-year-old Barbara Locci, a married woman and homemaker, and her lover, 29-year-old Antonio Lo Bianco, a mason worker. They were attacked in their car while Barbara's son, 6-year-old Natalino Mele, lay asleep in the back seat on a rural road in Signa, a small town west of Florence. Upon waking up, he found his mother dead and fled in shock to a nearby house, sounding the alarm. Barbara, originally from Sardinia, was well known in the community and often referred to by locals as the Queen Bee. Barbara and Antonio both had been shot with a .22 caliber handgun. Shell casings were recovered from the scene, and on July 20th, 1982, examining magistrate Vincenzo Tricomi found 5 bullets and 5 shell casings inappropriately stored in a folder among records of Mele's case file. But authorities were unable to reconstruct the chain of custody of this evidence. Forensic experts compared shell casings from the 1968 murder to those found at the newer crime scenes. Under a comparative microscope, they examined the microscopic firing pin impressions, the weapon's unique fingerprint. The result was staggering. Every bullet had been fired from the exact same gun. Not just the same model, but the exact same weapon. That discovery changed everything, but also leads investigators to a big problem, because that case was already closed and solved. Barbara Locci's older husband, Sardinian man Stefano Mele, was convicted of the murders. Jealousy, they said, a crime of passion. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. But Stefano Mele was released early because his 14-year-old sentence was treated as a domestic crime of passion rather than a murder. With time served, good behavior credits, and lenient penal policies of the era, he walked free after roughly 6 years. And let me just say this, back then, laws around violence against women, especially your own wife, were very different. And I feel like sometimes we feel more ahead legally and psychologically in society than we really actually are. Most Western countries only made intimate violence and assaults between spouses a crime in the 1990s. Italy in 1996. This is not long ago. And I just think we sometimes forget how long it took to get not even legal protections, but just basic equal rights. So if he didn't do it, who had access to the murder weapon and the opportunity to commit all these other murders? Several of Barbara's former lovers became suspects in the Monster of Florence investigation. Stefano Mele said it again and again. He was framed, pointing to the men orbiting his wife, the Sardinian Vinci brothers, Francesco Shepherd and Salvatore, his own brother Giovanni Mele, and his brother-in-law Piero Mucciarini. At the time, local rumor painted that circle steeped in rough business, allegedly even kidnappings for ransom and other violent trades. Then, just days after the 1982 murder of Paolo Mainardi and Antonella Migliorini, a car is found abandoned in the woods. Its owner? Francesco Vinci. A major break, the Carabinieri move fast. They initially detain him for domestic abuse and theft to hold him as a suspect in the serial case. He's a violent man, a known thug, and another one of Barbara Locci's lovers. But this was more than just jealousy. It was a small permissive circle where intimate acts, control and humiliation blurred together, and maybe turned deadly. Francesco, the younger, swaggering brother of Salvatore Vinci, carried a reputation for brutality and for slaughtering animals. He was possessive, domineering, physically abusive. He liked control, and he liked to make sure everyone knew that. This was the birth of what investigators call the Sardinia Trail. Sardinian migrants intertwined with the Mele and Vinci families, crossing paths, trading lovers and blame, while the bodies kept changing names. If Stefano Mele was a fall guy, Francesco Vinci might have been the one who pulled the trigger. Investigators suspected a shared weapon and began to build their case. It looked solid. They were ready to name him the Monster of Florence. The police also ran a newspaper appeal to the anonymous letter tipster to contact them again. It seemed like the tip came from someone who knew something, but the tipster's identity was never established. Then, another double murder, another couple, shot and staged. Killed in the exact same way like the other couples. Mario Spezzi, the journalist, happens to arrive at the scene. The police were in shock, he recalls, because they were sure the monster was Vinci. But the ballistic evidence is clear. It couldn't have been Vinci because he was in custody, and the monster had struck again. By 1983, 8 young people had been slaughtered in the Tuscan hills. In the beginning of September 1983, 2 24-year-old university students from Osnabrück, West Germany, Wilhelm Friedrich Horstmeier and Uwe Jens Rüsch, were visiting Italy to celebrate an important scholarship Meyer had just won. On September 9th, they parked their Volkswagen camper for the night in a vineyard by a villa locals knew as La Svachacha. Rolf Reinecke, a German expat and factory owner who lived nearby, happened upon them and warned it wasn't safe to sleep there overnight. But the happy-go-lucky Jens Uwe and Wilhelm stayed anyway. When they failed to meet him the following evening, Reinecke went looking. A local farmer had already spotted a van, thinking it was a road accident, and called the Carabinieri. Reinecke arrived among the first at the scene. Inside, 2 bodies, shot execution style, through the rear window of the van. At first glance, officers believed one victim was a woman because of Uwe's long blonde hair, delicate features, and slim build. They believed the killer was deceived and mistook him for a woman and committed the kill, but both were men. At the scene, torn-up, adult, explicit gay magazines are scattered around. When the killer discovered they were both male, he must have just left. And the monster's signature, the removal of the specific parts of the female victim, of course in this case, was missing too, which to investigators only confirms one thing. That act wasn't an afterthought. It was the purpose. The monster wasn't killing for revenge or even control. He was killing for ritual. The trajectory analysis suggests the shooter was 1.80 meters, 5'9" tall. He had now claimed 10 victims in 10 years, but his last 2 attempts had failed to deliver what he wanted, and investigators feared he wouldn't make the same mistake again. But now, if the killer is a lone assassin, it can't be Francesco Vinci, who is locked up during the time. Less than a year later, on the 29th July 1984, a young couple, 21-year-old law student Claudio Stefanacci and 18-year-old barmaid Pia Rontini, go missing after a night out near the town of Vicchio. They were found not far from where they had been last seen. Investigators believe the couple was ambushed in Claudio's Fiat Panda at La Busqueta, a wooded lover's spot. Pia actually managed to flee barefoot. at least for a few meters before another shot struck her down. And this time the ritual escalated. The killer went further, removing portions of her left chest and lower abdomen. The wounds looked almost anatomical. And again, there were reports of stalking. In the hours and days before the crime, a strange man seen following the couple in an ice cream parlor. A friend said Pia had complained about an unpleasant man at work. Crucially important here, Pia worked at a bar at the Vecchio train station cafe, where the owner remembered a man watching her and Claudio shortly before the murder. This further undermined the idea of the Sardinia Trail, as some of the suspects were in custody at the time of the murder. And then there's this. Stefania Pettini lived near the Vecchio train station bar. A decade later, Pierontini worked at the same bar and was herself killed. Florence was paralyzed with fear. Young couples no longer went to the countryside. Bars and shops displayed posters urging teens to stay in public and well-lit areas, to not drive into the hills, forests, or rural areas alone. But as a place visited by endless foreign tourists each year, not everyone got that warning. Pause for a second. If you're into these types of true crime cases, please subscribe to Deep, Dark, and Scary and like this video. On the night of the 7th or 8th September 1985, a French couple, 36-year-old tradeswoman Nadine Mouriot and 25-year-old musician Jean-Michel Creviqueville, a man of Georgian descent, pitched their tent in the woods at Scopetti, north of San Cassiano, west of Florence. Witnesses saw them at the country fair. They were unaware they had entered the monster's territory. That night, he struck again. He approached the tent on foot. Both were shot and stabbed while sleeping in their small tent in the woodland area near San Cassiano in Val di Pesa. Nadine was shot first and killed instantly. Jean-Michel was wounded, hit in the hand, trying to escape the tent, and fled. The monster chased him down through the dark woods. When he caught him, he stabbed him over and over. For the first time, the killer hides a body, but without any clear drag marks, then returns to the tent and Nadine's body, which will later show the same disturbing pattern as the woman before her. Nadine will be found inside the tent. Since the couple was foreign to Italy and on a holiday, no missing persons report had been filed yet. But this time, the killer did something new and deeply disturbing. He sent a package to the Florence State Prosecutor's office, addressed to Silvia Della Monica, inside a piece of the victim's left chest, mailed with deliberate timing. But why? To taunt investigators or to prove something to himself, that he was good at what he did after the chaos and unfinished rituals of the previous attacks? Or maybe it was a message, proof that he'd struck again before police even knew about 2 more victims. But that didn't work, because on the 9th of September, a local mushroom hunter stumbled on the campsite and called the Carabinieri. Officers secured the area hours before the taunting package reached the prosecutor's office. What followed crippled the case. The scene was irreversibly contaminated, missed evidence, and wouldn't be found for more than 30 years. Even the time and day of the death would become disputed. And this single botched crime scene would haunt the investigation forever. Still, the message was clear. He was watching, and he wanted to play. It reminded some of the Zodiac Killer case for its cryptic communications, explicit double murders, and the enduring mystery surrounding an elusive, never-caught killer. An unidentified murderer who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s, sending taunting letters, ciphers, and claiming multiple victims. The public was now beyond frightened. They were furious. The investigation had dragged on for over a decade. No arrests that stuck, no convictions, no justice. Florence was unraveling. The public pressure exploded. The judiciary was overwhelmed. And the case was officially transferred from local carabinieri to Italy's national police force. By the early 1990s, the Monster of Florence had killed 14 people and vanished. With no murders since 1985, pressure built on the new head of the investigation, Inspector Ruggero Perugini. He believed the monster was still alive, still out there and waiting. A new task force was formed. At the helm, Inspector Perugini. Perugini also admired the FBI, and he believed in behavioral profiling, data, patterns, structure. But even he would admit there was a sense of hopelessness. Every path had already been walked. The monster had been killing for over a decade. He knew the woods, he knew the timing, and he knew how to leave without a trace. But Perugini was determined to break that cycle. A new strategy was coming. and it would take the case in a dangerous direction. In 1988, at the request of Italy's Interior Ministry, the FBI Behavioral Science Unit reviewed the evidence and sent back a profile. Their assessment? The offender was likely an Italian male. He may have military experience, local to the area, deeply familiar with the terrain, and operating alone. He displays sadism, misogyny, and his pattern is to neutralize the male quickly to eliminate interference, then carry out the surgical ritual on the female. The .22 pistol and knife function as ritual instruments. Much like the retained body parts, he probably collects press clippings about the murders and takes perverse satisfaction in baiting and taunting investigators. That lone killer theory spread rapidly in Italy, but the FBI stressed their analysis was partial, grounded in U.S. cases, and explicitly cautioned that it could change if new facts emerged. Under Inspector Perugini's direction, investigators assembled one of the largest case files in Italian criminal history. Thousands of pages of witness statements, ballistic reports, behavioral analyses, Tuscany was mapped, and names from years of dead-end leads. He launched a massive screening program. Criminal records fed into newly centralized police databases. He recounted in an interview, "We started with those who had the means and the opportunity. Men with violent pasts, men who were free to move on the nights of the killings." From that mountain of evidence, they distilled a list of roughly 250 suspects. Gun owners, hunters, voyeurs, men with violent or certain types of offenses, and those tied to the old Sardinian circle. And one name kept resurfacing. A man with a record for assault, murder, and extreme violence. A man who lived in the heart of the monster's killing zone. Number 31 on the list, his name was Pietro Pacciani. Within a week of the Scopetti murders, police searched Pacciani's house, along with that of an associate living deep in the countryside. Those raids planted the first seeds of what would become the Pacciani track, on the hunt for the man police believed to be the Monster of Florence. Pacciani, born in Vecchio, was in his 60s when Chief Inspector Perugini's team zeroed in on him. A stocky farm laborer, married with 3 children, living in a crumbling farmhouse on the outskirts of San Cassiano. But in his past was a story far darker than it looked at first glance, and one that would make sense for a killer like the Monster of Florence. In 1951, Pacciani was engaged to a young woman reputed to be one of the local beauties. One day, he caught her being intimate in a parked car with a traveling salesman and exploded. He stabbed the man to death right in front of her and then violated her right next to the body. He was convicted and sentenced to 13 years in prison. But what intrigued Perugini wasn't just that murder. It was a detail from Pacciani's own court testimony. He said he was triggered by the sight of the girl's naked left chest, that it unchained something inside him. The words were chilling. Could this have been the monster's origin story? A crime of jealousy turned into a lifelong compulsion? Perugini questioned Pacciani personally, and despite the suspect's rough appearance, he was struck by how manipulative the man was. In an interview, he recounted, "He was clever. He tried to charm me, but I could see the control underneath." Investigators watched him closely. Though he claimed to be sick and frail, Pacciani was seen hauling tree trunks uphill on his farm, no signs of physical limitation. He was older, but still physically very strong, and maybe dangerous. To several investigators, his known behavior, impulsive, hands-on, predatory, clashed with the monster's clinical detachment at the crime scenes. Their argument, a man like Pacciani would have seized physical control, not maintained the cool surgical distance seen in the murders. If he could have, he would have. Touched, assaulted, and taken advantage of every situation, if you know what I mean. 7 years passed without another Lover's Lane double homicide. In 1987, Pacciani was convicted of assaulting his own daughters and sentenced to more than 6 years in prison. In 1992, an anonymous letter reopens the case, naming him the Monster of Florence. Police launched the longest search ever conducted on Italian soil. They searched Pacciani's home for 11 straight days, no sleep, no breaks, and it paid off. During the first search of Pacciani's house in September 1985, right after the Scopetti murders, investigators found nothing incriminating that directly tied him to the murders. But years later, the Carabinieri returned and miraculously found chilling evidence. violent explicit materials, satanic imagery, a camping soapbox, and tucked in a dusty drawer, a German sketch pad, a brand reportedly not sold in Italy. Prosecutors linked the last two items to the two young German students shot in '83. Pacciani himself claimed he'd picked up the sketch pad and soapbox at a dump. Tracing the origin, investigators discovered it had only been sold at one small store in Osnabrück, Germany, allegedly the same store where the two murdered German students, Wilhelm Meyer and Uwe Rusch, had bought their supplies before traveling to Tuscany. It wasn't enough to prove murder, but let's be honest, what are the odds? And something like this is just damning circumstantial evidence. Still, the case needed more. To convict him of homicide, they had to tie Pacciani to the murder weapon. Investigators had long theorized the .22 Beretta pistol used in the killings had originally belonged to someone connected to the 1968 murders, perhaps stolen or passed down, and it could have ended up in Pacciani's possession. Then, a quite astonishing, one could even say unbelievable breakthrough. While digging in Pacciani's garden, an officer spotted something metallic, an intact .22 caliber round. It was rushed to the forensic lab. There, Francesco Donato, head of Tuscany's forensic science unit, compared it to the bullets recovered from the monster's crime scenes. The cartridge had been fired from the exact same gun used in the double homicides. Finally, with this growing mountain of evidence, prosecutors felt they had a strong enough case to proceed and go to trial. In April 1994, Pacciani is formally charged with the murders. His wife receives an anonymous call. He will soon be, and the line goes dead. A sensational high-frenzy televised trial follows. Pacciani pleads not guilty. The courtroom is packed, the public upset, and the press swarms. Witnesses sketch a world of filth and brutality. Some witnesses' testimony veers into the absurd, but then Pacciani's daughters take the stand. And the mood changes. The room fills with anguish, shame, and their deep pain of what they went through. Over months in court, prosecution lays out the evidence, the anonymous letters, the infamous garden bullet, and the trove from Pacciani's home. His wife describes him as violent. On paper, Pacciani reads like the perfect lone culprit for the case, but another witness goes further, claiming he saw Pacciani with a second man in Pacciani's car on the night of September 8, 1985, near Scopetti, before the murders. His defense, Rosario Bevacqua and Pietro Fioravanti, pushes back. Fioravanti's son, Alessio, then a teenager, recalls visiting Pacciani. He was crude, off-putting, even predatory, a maniac, in his words, but also a rough Tuscan farmhand who in person didn't radiate the boogeyman aura of the Monster of Florence. The defense's office is inundated with anonymous letters, constant threats, claims from people saying they are the killer. But then something terrifying happens. Someone partially loosens the front wheel on Pietro Fioravanti's car, and while crossing a bridge in Florence, the wheel flies off. But he's driving slowly, and he walks away shaken, but alive. Still, in court, Pacciani's defense fights back and argues that the bullet from the garden is too new to tie him to the killings and doesn't prove anything. They say the satanic paintings entered into evidence are traced not to Pacciani at all, but to a Chilean artist. And Pacciani claimed the soapbox and sketchbook associated with the murdered German students he just picked up at a garbage dump. He insists he's innocent, framed, and a scapegoat. When he finally speaks, Pacciani asked authorities, "Why are you investigating me instead of the famous doctor?" 9 years after the last double murder, on November 1st, 1994, after months of trial, the verdict is in. Guilty. Pacciani is sentenced to 3 life terms in prison for 7 of the 8 double murders and transferred to a Florence prison. Locals can finally breathe again. A serial killer, they believe, is behind bars. But then a question lingers. Is Florence really free of the monster? Because what happened next would shake the case to the core. Pacciani's behind bars. While Florence exhales a breath of relief, the mystery is far from over. And just within days, new doubts began to surface, and the case is cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. Pacciani directly appeals the court's ruling of his conviction of the 7 double murders. Sister Anna Maria Mazzari, a prison volunteer, meets with him during his incarceration. She leaves convinced of one thing: I don't believe he was capable of such actions. Pacciani tells her he's being framed, He claims the bullet planted. And she's not the only one asking questions. And so a new lead investigator takes over, Michele Giuttari, head of the Florence Criminal Investigation Squad. Convinced the case hides a wider conspiracy, he orders fresh forensic reviews and reads the files. Right away, something strikes him as wrong. In the closed 1968 Locci and Lobianco case, fired rounds are still clipped inside the paper case folder, when by law such exhibits should be stored in the evidence room, and after a final verdict are typically destroyed. Why were they there? He compares ballistics. The original 1968 report noted base swelling on the shells and almost a total lack of extractor marks, classic signs of a worn chamber. But the cartridges sitting in that folder show neither trait. To Giuttari, that leaves two possibilities: planted rounds or two different .22 pistols. He attacks the one gun, one box story next. But the physical ammo isn't uniform. Some bullets are copper-jacketed, others plain lead. If the ammunition can't be unified, the single unspent Gordon bullet used against Pacciani in court loses weight. Then he follows the money. For a farm laborer, Pacciani is suddenly flush, buying 2 houses and spreading postal saving bonds across multiple post offices in and around San Cassiano, sometimes on the same day or around the most important key dates of the case and murders. Yet not every document reaches Giuttari. Inside Italy's Interior Intelligence Service, a parallel file sits out of view. He keeps digging for Pacciani's accomplices, unaware that critical names and notes are sealed in intelligence dossiers he can't access or is even aware of. Doubt begins to swirl around the 1985 French tourist murder of Nadine and Jean-Michel, also dubbed the Scopetti murders, the monster's final and most gruesome crime. The autopsy report says they were murdered on Sunday night, but the food contents in their stomachs, rabbit ragu pasta, were traced to a dinner they had eaten Saturday. If they were killed Saturday night, Pacciani had a proper alibi. Dozens of people saw him at a village festival that night. But medical experts disagree. Some stand by the Sunday time of death estimate, others argue the advanced decomposition of the bodies makes the estimate unreliable. One pathologist who reviewed the evidence later said, "I still believe they died Saturday evening." And then other questions emerged. Jean-Michel was young, athletic. He had escaped the tent, ran into the woods. Could a 60-year-old man with heart problems, emphysema, and multiple bypass surgeries, even if he was physically strong enough to carry heavy stuff, but would he really be able to chase down a 25-year-old through the woods in the dark at night, catch him, and then kill him? The court isn't convinced. Pacciani wins his appeal on not having committed the facts. In February 1996, Pacciani's conviction is overturned by the court and he's declared innocent and is released. But prosecutors aren't backing down. They return to the evidence. Officer Giuttari goes back to San Cassiano, where Pacciani lives, and where he lingers. The Bar Central besides the former Calamandrei pharmacy. He believes if Pacciani had accomplices, they'll surface here. 2 names rise fast as Pacciani's closest companions: Mario Vanni, a retired postman, and Giancarlo Lotti, a quarry worker who sleeps at a church-run hostel. Giuttari orders wiretapes on Vanni's phone and on the bar's line. Lotti has no phone, but he is there most days. The case takes another sharp and shocking turn. Police uncover evidence that Pacciani maybe wasn't acting all alone. What emerges is disgusting. Pacciani, Vanni, and Lotti drink together. They cruise for adult workers together and prowl country lanes peeping at couples. In San Cassiano, everyone knows who they are. One of those people is Luciano Malatesta, who grew up in their shadow. As a child, he says he saw Vanni in his home and his mother with Pacciani. He remembers Pacciani's violence, beatings, threats. To Luciano, they weren't drinking buddies, but a gang. In a documentary, Luciano for the first time shares his childhood accounts and alleges that Vanni and Pacciani assaulted his mother and that the man moved inside a wider criminal circle tied to a coven led by his aunt. When Giuttari's team starts asking questions, several Florence area adult workers begin to cooperate. One of them, Gabriella Giribelli, well known among San Cassiano clients, phones Giancarlo Lotti, furious that his name has dragged her into the case and she is questioned. Investigators also research Pacciani's home and find something else, a drawing, a woman's left chest outlined and her private areas marked with red ink, basically a mirror of the monster's ritual. To police, it's not just disturbing, but in a sense, a confession. They also speak to the two closest associates, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti. Questioned by detectives, Lotti cracks under pressure and confesses to helping Pacciani commit the murders. He claims they both have been present and describes details that only the killer could know. But despite some contradictions, he offers details investigators consider usable and that were never released in the press. He says the group was present at the 82 attack and the 84 Vicchio murders, claiming he himself pointed out the couple they should target next to Vanni. He talks about roles, who shot, who cut, and who watched. The press dubs them compagni di merende, translated to snack buddies or picnicking friends. Based on testimony and wiretapes describing Vanni, Lotti, and Pacciani spending long afternoons together, hanging at the Bar Central, then driving into the countryside with wine, salami, and bread for a merenda, a picnic, while peeping on couples and visiting adult workers. We live in a crazy world. And the image of these middle-aged men out for a snack or a picnic while circling crime areas was just darkly ironic and frankly quite absurd. And Lotti adds a startling motive for the 1983 double murder of the German students. He claims he pulled the trigger himself, blackmailed by Pacciani over intimate encounters between the two of them, and says the hit was staged by them to get Francesco Vinci out of jail. Because investigators and the public then believed in a lone killer theory, a new double homicide would undercut the case against whoever was locked up and would force a release. Police at the time believe Pacciani manipulated them, controlled them to a degree, coercing, directing, and pulling them into his grotesque rituals. In an interview, one investigator said Pacciani was a strong personality. He could dominate people, he could dominate them. But some of their statements wander, contradict, and are inconsistent. He misremembers, mixes things up, and gets material details wrong. He, for example, places the two German students in the front of the van, though the victims were conclusively shot in the rear. A glaring mismatch for someone claiming to have been there. Yet he also offers non-public details. After the 1984 Vecchio killings, the knife was washed in the river. At Scopetti in 1985, the tent was slit from the bottom up. His roles and dates wobble. He calls himself the lookout in September 85 with Mario Vanni cutting the tent and Pacciani firing through the front, fueling doubts and critics that much of his story echoed press coverage and say his confessions could have been coached or contaminated. And another issue was speed. Jean-Michel fled barefoot into the woods. None of the named aging men seemed capable of running him down. Giuttari keeps listening to Lotti and hours of phone taps on the man. And witnesses keep talking about the famous doctor. And investigators start to uncover a theory darker than just a lone sadist. They began to suspect a fourth participant, who was identified by sources as physician Francesco Narducci from Perugia, a city less than 2 hours southeast of Florence. And this leads straight into the darkest theory. A ring of men from good addresses, a doctor, a pharmacist, paying clients, commissioning trophies. Testimony speaks of black rites, satanic masses, and parties with adult, intimate group activities, if you know what I mean, in villas around San Cassiano. And in these stories, a figure emerges. Locals call him the sorcerer of San Cassiano, but his real name is Salvatore Indovino, living in a crumbling farmhouse with his much younger partner Filippa Nicoletti. To be clear, what follows here is just allegations, no settled facts. But surely these are the claims that push the investigation far beyond the idea of just a singular killer. And Luciano Malatesta gives one of the most unsettling statements about his time as a teenager when he and his family in 1981 moved in next door to Salvatore Indovino and Filippa. Luciano says Indovino frightened him from the start. Dark glasses, a violent aura, and that the farmhouse was filthy, with a secretive room he was warned never to enter. According to Luciano, the black masses weren't usually held there, but in villas owned by well-connected Florentines. Most of what Luciano knows came from his sister Milva, who along with her husband Vincenzo Limonghi both became involved with the coven. He says his sister Milva confided that she had witnessed satanic events with intimate adult group activities linked to the same circle rumored to intersect with the Monster of Florence cases. And her description was stark. Black hoods, a cup of blood passed hand to hand, followed by physical acts of intimacy. One detail stunned him. His sister allegedly recognized a boy from his elementary school. An alarming picture emerged, where even children were involved in gatherings. And if you know these types of stories and allegations, so to say, then you know what arena we're in now, and it's not good. Beyond Pacciani, Lotti, and Vanni, witnesses floated the Vinci brothers. Local adult workers, they said, acted as intermediaries, steering targets or arranging meetings. Above them, multiple witnesses placed well-connected Florentines at sinister rites. And according to Luciano, Milva told him outright that powerful figures enabled the murders, and that a Florentine magistrate was involved too. The participant, he says, was allegedly prosecutor Pierluigi Vigna, who later became Italy's national anti-mafia prosecutor, and a figure she called Calamandrei, along with their own aunt and uncle. And again, these are purely allegations. Prosecutor Vigna was never convicted of anything related to the Monster of Florence case, and no court has established any of these claims as fact. But Luciano recounts another memory in that first ever interview on camera and says, as a teen, he'd seen a tall man visit his aunt, smoking, half hiding his face. And years later, while talking to prosecutor Vigna, he recognized the same mannerisms and the prosecutor from back then and basically put it together. And he asked Vigna, "Did you know my Aunt Maria?" And that Vigna replied, "Shut up." But as you can imagine, those fueled people's belief that powerful figures hovered over the case. Luciano's Aunt Maria, as per witnesses, was cast as the priestess, with Indovino, the sorcerer of San Cassiano, as the high priest and fixer. Adult worker Gabriella Giribelli described to investigators clients across the spectrum, from laborers like Pacciani, Lotti, and Vanni to affluent professionals and personalities. From statements gathered by the Florence prosecutor's office, drawing almost exclusively from Gabriella, a lot of things went down at the home of the magician Salvatore Indovino, which was just 2 kilometers from the last double homicide. For prosecutors, Indovino became a key figure in the crimes. A highly suggestive account from a painter called Silvia del Secco also made it into police files. She was house hunting in San Cassiano in the early 80s when she stopped before a building marked for sale. 2 men stood at the entrance. One of them, she learned, was Salvatore Indovino, a magician famous for love potions. I mean, you can't even make this up. And during their brief exchange, the magician told her that to bind a couple forever, he needed a piece of the man's clothing, a photo of him, the woman's private secretion, and hair from that area. And the pair needed to be intimate in an open place, like a car, and informing him of the day, spot, and vehicle. Disturbed by this, she left. But a decade later, in July 94, during Pacciani's trial, she reported this conversation to police. And honestly, thank God she did, because it's a really disturbing statement with extremely bizarre details. But in the context of this case, they're really important, because most couples murdered by the Monster of Florence were attacked after or during an intimate act. And this pattern was one of the key reasons investigators later believed the killer was either in that way repressed and ritually driven, or motivated by voyeuristic rage. And then further details come from a witness called Lorenzo Nessi, who relayed in April 2003 what he said he heard from his friend Vanni. In that place where Indovino lived, strange, truly nasty things were done. So much so that Vanni himself was disgusted by them. They weren't parties, but something more sinister, which always had to do with perversions and extreme arts of the act. It occurs to me that Sperduto's daughter, the one who was killed, as I understood from Vanni, must have suffered a series of very specific acts of violence that I can't explain during those gatherings. Sperduto was a minor witness in the Snack Buddies investigation and an acquaintance of Vanni and Lotti. And Indovino himself wasn't really clean. He was a laborer from Catania, born in 1922, and served 19 years for murder. Then he moved to Alessandria in the 1970s, where he met his partner Filippa, who was about 30 years younger than him. And they together moved to Sicily, Prato, and finally to San Cassiano, where he allegedly pushed Nicoletta into adult work. Indovino was in and out of prison around 1981, and that's where he met Francesco Vinci, because they shared 3 weeks together in detention. For the first 4 monster murders, he was reportedly either away or incarcerated. Multiple witnesses confirmed that after his release, Indovino began working as a magician, preparing these love potions and soon becoming known as the magician or the sorcerer of San Cassiano. According to adult worker Gabriella Giribelli, between 1984 and 1985, the house hosted seances and black masses with heavy drinking that ended in the physical acts and included young people who should have absolutely not been there. And she said that they call certain notable figures and high up society type people the second level. Locals also recalled many transient women, often homeless, drifting, or using drugs. A grocer that lived close by to Indovino's house stated, "Some women I had seen also frequented that house, but whom I didn't know, and therefore I'm unable to provide details. The fortune teller often hosted wayward girls in his home, whom he picked up in the evenings in Florence, but I don't know where exactly. These girls would stay at the fortune teller's house for a few days, and before leaving, they would stop at my shop to have a cappuccino with the fortune teller. I would then see them leave, but I don't know where they went. I must have seen them 3 or 4 times. And I mean, this pattern reminds me so much of Fred and Rosemary West's house on 25 Cromwell Street in the UK. I made a long video that you can watch on my channel about it, but they also preyed on vulnerable girls and women and got away with it for far too long. And allegedly, they too were tied to occult practices with whispers of official cover-ups. I didn't talk about that in my video because the case is closed and officially none of that was really part of the case, so I left it out. But if you even look at my comments, like a lot of people talk about it there that are from Gloucester and have, you know, some sort of a personal local experience and heard the rumors and the stories. Pause for a second. If you're into these types of true crime cases, please subscribe and like this video. Salvatore Indovino died of cancer in August 1986. And about a decade later, still convinced of his involvement, the Florence prosecutor's office sought to exhume his coffin in Sicily, hoping to find the .22 Beretta weapon. And to be crystal clear again, all of this remains allegations. No findings were ever proven in court. But in the files, they fuel the theory that the killing served a ritual demand for fetishes and weird occult practices of the elite. And then there's also a storyline that a figure known as the Doctor may have stood above the killers and served as a fixer. And Pacciani, Lotti, and Vanni as some sort of foot soldiers. Inside Giuttari's squat room, these statements shaped a working theory that the monster murders fed a market, and young couples seeking privacy in the Tuscan hills, intercepted by not a lone hunter, but, so the allegation goes, by hired assassins acting on behalf of clients who commissioned and also shielded the killings through inner workings at the top, so that the alleged network stayed hidden by design. And a tough question keeps resurfacing. If investigators and witnesses push the idea of the hidden mandanti, that is translated as the instigators, back in the day during the case, did someone high up got nervous? Giuttari, who had battled the 'Ndrangheta and Cosa Nostra in the south, took command of Florence's criminal investigations, and almost immediately the pressure changed in his life. He recalls serious death threats, and he recounts in a documentary, one morning all 4 tires on his private car were slashed. He had lived with a serious risk in mafia cases, but he said this felt different, closer, more personal, and more dangerous. And he wasn't the only one scared. Luciano is still haunted by what he was told by his sister. On the 20th of August 1993, Milva Malatesta, his sister, was found burned in her Fiat Panda, together with his 3-year-old son Mirko, just weeks before Pacciani was formally indicted again. He says the cost to his family has been crushing. 4 relatives gone, under either suspicious circumstances or outright murdered. He proclaimed someone has to get the truth out. His sister had confided in him that she was preparing to go public with the identities of members of the satanic sect before she too was killed. She knew she was in danger and she had to talk. Milva, unfortunately, never had the chance to do that. What Luciano is certain of is this: a powerful machine of mystification and manipulation was set in motion when the suspect list and investigation reached certain people. Besides Milva, several others from that same circle, witnesses, acquaintances, even locals who seemed to know more, who might have identified the people allegedly involved, would later die under violent and suspicious circumstances. More to that in a moment. But in 1998, Vanni and Lotti were convicted. Vanni received a life sentence, and Lotti, who cooperated, got 26 years. The court now believes the monster wasn't one man, but a group. A circle of sadists, predators, a cabal hiding in plain sight. With the new convictions, police prepared a new trial to retry Pacciani. They believe this time the case will be unbreakable, with his accomplices already in prison, that they'll prove he wasn't just involved, but the ringleader. Then, on the 22nd February 1998, 13 years after the last double homicide, and before the retrial can begin, Pacciani is found dead, slumped in his home on the evening of returning to court. Convinced he might be silenced, he had lived locked inside his house. After decades of chain smoking, obesity, and 2 bypass surgeries, his heart was severely damaged, exhausted, overworked, and beyond repair. Heart failure, allegedly. When investigators entered the modest farmhouse, they found Pacciani lying dead on the ground. He was 73 years old. And just like that, Pacciani is gone. And with him, the final chance to put the Monster of Florence on trial again dies. But for some, his death didn't close the book. It just opened another chapter. Authorities did not order a full forensic autopsy. And no involvement of potential foul play was ever even considered at the time of his death. That decision, the autopsy reportedly being limited to an external exam, has fueled years of speculation. Even today, many investigators, journalists, and citizens remain divided. Some are absolutely certain that Pacciani was the Monster of Florence. After all, the killing stopped after his and his comrades' names surfaced. An investigator on the case stated, "Once the investigation led us to Pacciani, there were no more victims. Hence, the investigation made sense. I'm 100% convinced he was guilty." But others aren't so sure. Pacciani's defense attorney's son, Alessio Fioravanti, later said he believed Pacciani was murdered, citing how the body was discovered halfway between rooms with his trousers down, and the presence of a drug considered dangerous for Pacciani's heart condition. When Pacciani's defense lawyer, Fioravanti, requested the complete forensic file on Pacciani's death, he says it never arrived. Forensic voices noted a body that had been moved. And more cryptic, the Carabinieri recorded a peculiar detail at the scene: a bleach-soaked piece of fabric covering his lower body. Around the same time, more deaths, often brutal ones, began to cluster among people orbiting the case. Defense lawyer Fioravanti kept a list of the dead. Locals whispered a pattern: whoever crossed Indovino died. Mila had confided in her brother Luciano that terrible things happened in that orbit. On May 19, 1991, Vincenzo Limongi, Milva's husband, was also discovered hanged in his cell, both feet allegedly touching the ground. He was actually under arrest for petty crimes, theft, robberies, and drug dealings. Limongi was a small-time offender who cycled in and out of jail on those charges. He was being held at a Florence prison when he was found hanged the day before his scheduled release in May 1991. It just sounds like a very odd coincidence to me that Pacciani dying the day before the retrial starts, and then Limongi dying in prison the day before he's released. I mean, it really sounds more like someone is cleaning up loose ends or is sending a message to other people who are involved or know things. And let me know what you think about this in the comments. But they weren't the only ones that lost their lives. Several other people linked to key figures died under troubling circumstances. What follows is a grim list of, as far as I could find, at least 20 collateral deaths orbiting the case that have taken place between 1972 and 2002. Episodes that some dismiss as coincidences and others read as calculated silencing. Listen, there are not many cases like this, but it's interesting how they always end up with dozens of dead witnesses or people tied to the case. Remember Francesco Vinci, one of the Sardinian men and a former lover of Barbara Locci, the monster's first female victim? He spent years under suspicion and was jailed while the real killer kept striking and killing people. And then after his 1982 to 1983 imprisonment and release, he had kind of faded entirely from the case. But then in August 1993, he was found hog-tied and burned in the trunk of his car near Pisa. In late 2024, his remains were exhumed, and in March 2025, so just this year, DNA testing confirmed that the body was his, closing long-running doubts from his family. With a reference profile now in hand, prosecutors could, in theory, compare Vinci's DNA to the partial degraded male genetic traces recovered in 2018 from, for example, the 85 Scopetti bullet. But decades of handling and mishandling have so compromised the evidence that this case just, unfortunately, may never be solved, and leaving the true identity of the monster or the monsters of Florence a mystery. And then there are multiple relatives and associates or core figures of this case who were found hanging, burned, stabbed, or strangled, all tied by overlapping proximity to the suspects, intimate or family relationships like the Malatesta, Vinci circles, shared locations, and recurring names from witness statements like Indovino, Vanni, Pacciani, and most of these cases just remain unsolved. Florence, adult workers said to have taken part in these intimate group activities at the parties, were slain by unknown hands with similar methods as used in the monster murders. Two of these women had ties to men later drawn into the Monster of Florence inquiry, Mario Vanni and Salvatore Vinci. Giuliana was stabbed in her apartment. Another adult worker was killed with a knife and strangled with a telephone cord in 1983. The same year, an adult worker called Luisa was killed with cotton balls packed into her mouth and nose, and her arms bound with a jacket. And then there were others that really stood out to me. In 1981, Susanna Cambi, one of the women who was killed with her fiancé Stefano Baldi in the woods by the monster, told friends that she was being followed. And within a year, her best friend, Elisabetta Ciabani, who lived near Susanna, was murdered as well and found stabbed while on a holiday in Sicily. Seemingly another unsolved crime. But her death was officially ruled a suicide by Sicilian prosecutor's office, and years later, the Florence office revisited Elisabetta's death, and forensic pathologist Professor Mari leaned towards the conclusion that it was a suicide, though he noted that there were some oddities. For example, there were no fingerprints of Elisabetta on the knife handle itself. So obviously the doubts persist, but the ruling was never changed. And then there's this. The two German students were shot near a villa, which had a reputation for these adult group activities during parties. Multiple of the murdered girls of the couples confided in friends and family members that they were being basically stalked and harassed by a man or different men. No one really knows. And then there were the French tourists who were seen at a local fair where Pacciani was present. Is that all coincidence or community? The picture that forms is of victims intersecting at times with the same small web of men. And to my mind comes, what if the couples were actively chosen and followed and stalked, maybe even over multiple days, and not just found randomly out in the woods? Let me know what you think in the comments. Just an unbelievable case. Despite the climate of fear, prosecutor Canessa and investigator Giuntari secured a definitive ruling. 16 years after the last double murder in 2001, Italy's Supreme Court confirmed the convictions of the so-called Picnicking Friends, Pacciani's alleged accomplices. The letters, the threats, the collateral deaths, none of it, in their view, erased the core verdicts. With those convictions upheld just 3 years after the first guilty verdict, the Florence prosecutor's office authorized a new emphasis: hunt the instigators. In 2001, a beautician recorded threatening phone calls. She reported that her son had been targeted by a satanic sect operating in the area around Perugia. The recording, chilling in tone, was logged by authorities and folded into the expanding file. For the first time ever, two of the names surfaced in the same sinister frame: Pacciani and Dr. Francesco Narducci, both dead. The calls contained insults, threats, and a refrain: "will make you end up like Pacciani," followed by "the doctor in Lake Trasimeno," identified by the caller as the great Dr. Narducci. Because the tapes explicitly reference Narducci and a homicide, Perugia prosecutor Mignini opens a murder inquiry and an investigation that will define his career. Mignini took charge of the so-called Narducci branch of the Monster of Florence case, working alongside veteran homicide chief Giuntari. Together they reopened the investigation in the early 2000s, convinced the murders were the work of an organized network. To investigators Giuntari and Canessa, it was one more shard pointing towards organizers and patrons. To critics, it was another provocative thread in a case already tangled with anonymous tips, calls and letters, disputed memories, and the unnerving sense that speaking out could be fatal. Claims are contested outside the investigative team and were never established as judicial fact and are, as of now, just alleged. Investigators cited a chilling analog: the Chicago Rippers, also called the Ripper Crew. For Italian investigators, that case proves murder for ritual does exist. Whether a comparable structure operated in Tuscany remains the open and fiercely debated question. I find it quite interesting because there's this big notion in the media that it's all just hysteria, that satanic killings just don't exist. But can we really believe that certain sick things just don't exist? I think it's a dark and scary world out there, and we probably don't even know half of what happens. The awful things that go on every single day in our own cities and wherever we live. And I'm not saying certain things happen everywhere, but I also don't think we can just flat out deny that there are small groups of people who believe in certain things and who will do certain things to satisfy their own twisted, disturbing desires. And did this actually happen in this case? Maybe not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that we should keep an open mind and not just dismiss witnesses, testimonies, or even circumstantial evidence right from the start, just because it points in a direction that feels too awful to be accepted as truth. And talking about keeping an open mind, you will need it for the next part of the story. Now to Lake Trasimeno in Umbria. It's October the 8th in 1985. The doctor Francesco Narducci, a well-liked, handsome physician from Perugia and a fixture of the city's upper circles, goes to work as usual. Sometimes that day he takes a phone call, drives to his family's lakeside villa, walks to the jetty at San Feliciano, unties his boat, and motors toward Paul Veyes Island. Then he disappears. 5 days later, Sunday, October 13th at 7:20 a.m., a body is recovered from the lake and identified as Dr. Narducci. The corpse is brought to the jetty and partially undressed. No proper autopsy is performed that day. No comprehensive forensic exam is conducted, and the body is not transferred for the standard post-mortem autopsy one would ordinarily expect. A photographer from La Nazione documents the recovery, images that in sequence more than a decade later will become pivotal when the death is re-examined. Back then, a young, relatively inexperienced female doctor came to the scene where Narducci's body was found. She notes no visible signs of trauma and certifies the cause of death as drowning. And just as a side note, if you want to know more about the forensics and how in cases where bodies are found in water, the cause of death is often ruled drowning by basically default, even when something more intentionally could have happened to the person. I made a whole video about that and I will link that below. But anyway, 16 years pass and Perugia prosecutor Mignini reopens the file and flags immediate discrepancies. Errors on the death certificate and photographs showing a markedly darkened body. Mignini orders a photogrammetric analysis using the since 1985 unaltered paving pattern of the jetty to estimate the corpse's height. The results suggest that recovered body appears shorter than Dr. Narducci. Mignini forms a radical theory, a body swap. And I'm repeating this, a body swap must have happened. In his view, an unknown man's corpse was placed in the lake to be found and displayed, sealed in the coffin and later exchanged for Narducci's actual remains, after which the unknown body was disposed of. Before seeking exhumation, Mignini asked Professor Pierucci, head of the forensic medicine, to review the paperwork. Pierucci says a proper autopsy is necessary. Despite the family opposing this and public ridicule at the idea of a body swap, the court authorizes exhumation 16 years after the recovery from the lake. And I really find the will to get down to the bottom of things so admirable, despite that it must have basically made the investigators and prosecutors seem completely out of their minds with a theory like this. And it can also have grave repercussions on one's career and personal life. So my respects for going down that route and letting literally just the evidence drive the path and the way to solve a case. And you may have guessed it, the report that follows is insane. Features observed of the body pulled out of the lake at the jetty, baldness, a large head, a distended abdomen, do not match Narducci's known appearance at all, since he had a full head of hair, a narrower skull, and small-sized trousers. The new autopsy then addresses the cause of death. Pierucci's team identifies a clear fracture of the upper thyroid cartilage, classic for homicidal throttling, consistent with firm localized pressure applied over time. Their conclusion, Narducci did not drown, and he was killed by manual strangulation. I mean, you can't make this all up. This reminds me so much of Stranger Things, and at this point we're in trust absolutely nothing territory. And remember when they placed a fake body that resembled Will Byers in the lake to cover up his kidnapping by the Demogorgon? And Jim Hopper, the police officer, becomes suspicious after I think the normal local coroner was mysteriously replaced by a state official who then was supposed to handle Will Byers' alleged autopsy. And I think Hopper then goes and breaks into the morgue just to find some sort of a Will Byer-looking type of silicone doll replica. And literally, this is the type of shit that we're talking about here in this case. But it happened in real life. And is it just me, or is this just absolutely insane? Like, what is going on? And honestly, good on these investigators. I just can't believe how the families of the victims must feel with the sheer overload of madness that this terrible case entails. It's just heartbreaking, and I almost feel like hope at justice here is at zero. I mean, how could you even believe in that when you hear all these insane stories that are part of this case? But anyway, this is why we keep talking about these types of cases, because they really deserve to not just be forgotten. And maybe one day someone comes forward who, can shine a light on what's still hidden and what we don't know. But of course, this is not just it. It gets even crazier. So listen to this. One more bizarre detail here deepens the mystery. As Pacciani's body, upon being found dead years later, Narducci's body is exhumed with a cloth covering the lower abdomen, an apron-like panel. So both people, same thing. And the research commissioned by Mignini ties the cloth to archaic Masonic symbolism. Allegedly, the expert opinion describes it as a punitive apron used in a ritual context marking degradation. But its real meaning has never been fully explained. That finding and other investigative work drew Freemasonry into the narrative. Mignini looked at the overlap between Dr. Narducci's death and Freemasonry, and he noted that Narducci, his father and grandfather, and several of his relatives were Freemasons, and Masonic involvement was part of their family tradition spanning over at least 3 generations. And according to investigators, these were connections that may have extended into Florence's professional and social elite circles. Prosecutors said lodges had discussed the case internally and took decisions, whatever that means, around the case of the Monster of Florence. And I cannot explain everything about Freemasons here, but let me give you a tiny summary of sorts. And I actually did go down a little rabbit hole of the rules around these aprons upon one's death. and what it all could mean, especially with the bleach. I really didn't like that. I'm also sure that certain lodges around the world may interpret things differently. And especially back in the day, and for example, in a country like Italy, that has a vast religious history and is rather on the more religious side of things. I've also found some commenters in forums online saying that it's not allowed to clean the aprons and that it's a disrespect to the Masonic order. So there seems to be a serious demeaning symbolic of this. I mean, one can only guess at this point. But Freemasonry is the world's largest and among the oldest private fraternal organizations, and is officially best described as a society with secrets and not a secret society. Make of that what you will. So Freemasons are allegedly public about their lodges and charity, but private about their rituals, votes, and modes of recognition. Freemasons, as we know them today, took shape in Scotland and England in the late 15th century, and the first Grand Lodge was founded in London in June 1717. For centuries, it has drawn conspiracies about secret political sway, occult rites, revolutions, and the New World Order plots. Mainstream lodges deny these claims, and historians generally see an Enlightenment era fellowship and a mutual aid network that's long been a lightning rod for anti-Masonic backlash. For example, the Catholic Church's position is explicit and has since the Middle Ages condemned membership in Masonic associations. And just in 1983, it was officially reaffirmed that Masonic principles are irreconcilable with the doctrine of the Church, and Catholics who enroll are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion. And the piece of cloth is one of Freemasonry's oldest symbols, representing purity, moral conscience, and the Mason's labor. Many jurisdictions observe a funeral custom of placing a Mason's apron on or in the coffin. Practices vary by lodge and religion, and there's no universal rule. If you have any idea about Freemasonry, these aprons, and what it could all mean, or what it all meant back in the day in the Florence region in regards to this case, please leave me a comment and let me know about it, because I am so intrigued, to say the least. Although the murder of Narducci ultimately times out under Italy's statute of limitations, the judicial record from that proceeding accepts two core points. Narducci was murdered and the body swap did occur. Even so, a limit remains. There's no definitive proof that Narducci participated in the monster murders. As Mignini frames it, any next step would be to identify who benefited from falsifying the doctor's death. By now, 22 years have passed. The original anti-monster squad has been dissolved. The case splinters between hands-on killers and alleged instigators, while the central questions refuse to be answered. Because of the strength of the Narducci exhumation findings and the 1985 procedural irregularities and issues, Mignini indicts several officials alleging felonies tied to what he now views as an institutional travesty. And surely he was right about that. It's actually quite admirable and astounding that there was someone in office who went after other officials as well who allegedly committed misconduct in regards to a big and most important case like this. Allegedly, people say in these types of cases, the good guys that really seek truth and justice are usually kicked off pretty quickly. And it seems like these decisions often come from high up and could be strategical methods to sabotage cases and prevent crimes from getting solved. But as you can imagine, let's not hold our breath here quite yet. Other inquiries had traced Narducci towards son Cassiano. His father-in-law owned a cake factory there, where members of the Malatesta family worked. As a youth, Luciano visited his Aunt Maria often. And one day, his aunt embraced a young man and said, "Look who's here." And it was Francesco Narducci. So there is definitely a connect there too. All these people were somehow tied together and all knew each other. And we don't know what their dealings really were, but it seems like allegedly something was going on. Jutari's squad orders another round of forensic audit, and a cornerstone cracks. Independent reviewers of the unspent .22 round found in Pietro Pacciani's garden conclude it was planted. They said microscopic findings looked artificial, And the cartridge shows no true chambering. The blunt interference from critics, someone engineered a lone killer narrative. If so, there must have been a mole inside the system. In 2004, Giuntari asked to retest items a passerby found near the Scopetti clearing days after the 85 murders. He later says that his team located inside a Florence prosecutor's office a plastic bag holding a blood-soaked handkerchief and 2 surgical gloves. He alerts the magistrate and requests DNA testing, technology unavailable in 85, but gets no authorization. Then the institutional clash erupts. Giuntari then informs Perugia's Menini, who indicts Florence's head prosecutor for alleged interference. And Florence fires back, accusing Menini and Giuntari of abuse of office tied to wiretapes authorized by Perugia judges. Searches hit Menini's and Giuntari's offices, where the Narducci dossier is confiscated. And in the end, 2 parallel truths define this chapter. In Perugia, a court recognized homicide and alleged body swap, and in Florence, an inquiry mired in turf wars, block tests, and evidence handling contradictions that keep the monster file as murky and contested as ever. And although an appeals court orders the files returned, the momentum dies. 7 years on, Menini, Giuntari, and Florence's chief prosecutor are found not guilty of misconduct. And there are 2 more key characters tied to this case I need to include in this episode. Flagged as number 38 on the 1985 suspect list is Giampiero Vigilanti, born in Vecchio, living in Prato, who was a former French Foreign Legion paratrooper with a history of violence and weapons expertise. 8 days after the 85 Scopetti murders, the Carabinieri searched his home and logged 2 weapons, one of them a .22 high-standard pistol. In 2018, his name was found in a dossier of Italy's intelligence services. There was a handwritten note that stated the ammunition was consistent with the Monster of Florence's weapon. And then in 2015, prosecutor Canessa reopens on new clues. Vigilantes reported gun thefts and a circle of legionnaire acquaintances. In 2017, investigators took formal steps, but by 2019, prosecutors moved to close the case for a lack of evidence. Investigators also noted monster press clippings kept at his and his mother's homes and other suggestive items. Among his clippings, a piece on the 1974 double homicide, followed by articles from each subsequent attack, was found. Yet in 1974, he could not have foreseen the series of murders. On paper, Vigilanti overlapped several points of the 1988 FBI behavioral sketch: a local Tuscan male, military training, weapons adept, intimate with the back roads and the woods, making him a plausible but unproven fit. After the brief resurgence, the dossier returned to archive with the familiar verdict: suggestive fragments, no charge, and no judicial closure. And then there's the pharmacist. From testimonies and tips, his name was Francesco Calamandrei. He was a Florentine pharmacist and businessman who came under investigation in the early 2000s. And Calamandrei was suspected of being linked to a possible group of mandanti, the instigators, behind the monster killings. His name appeared in the files because of indirect connections, acquaintances, phone records, and overlaps in social circles around the Tuscan elite. Witnesses say Narducci was friendly with Calamandrei, that they moved in the same underworld with the same fetishes and visited the same adult workers. And Narducci's death remains a pivot point for the investigators because the Lover's Lane murders stop after October 85, yet there's no smoking gun linking him in court to the homicides. Narducci was never charged, and Calamandrei has consistently denied ever even meeting him, despite accusations from his then-wife. In spring 1988, 3 years after the last known killings, Francesco Calamandrei's wife accused the San Cassiano pharmacist of being the Monster of Florence. Her allegations came alongside multiple psychiatric evaluations, citing long-standing paranoid schizophrenia and psychosis, so investigators treated her claims with extreme caution. In 2008, Calamandrei was accused of belonging to or financing a secret occult-leaning circle, or an elite group that's supposedly said to have ordered the monster killings to harvest parts for ritual use of black masses and ceremonies. But he was acquitted in a fast-track trial of charges linked to the 14 homicides. He has consistently denied any connection to Dr. Narducci or to the alleged cult itself. And while the court acknowledged his use of adult workers and his association with Salvatore Indovini, it found no evidentiary link to the murders, and prosecutors did not pursue additional filings. Calamandrei was fully acquitted, and officially, the alleged cult remained nothing more but a rumor. But today, only one thing remains certain. The Monster of Florence still cast a shadow over Tuscany, and his legacy was one of trauma, etched into the memories of every investigator who worked the case, every local who lived in fear, and every tourist who passed through Florence during those times. Some of the investigators couldn't sleep. Some never fully recovered. The violence those women suffered, I had nightmares, said one pathologist. I woke up many nights with the image of the cut bodies in my head. Those are not things you forget. Later, an evidence review in 2018 under a new generation of prosecutors and on behalf of the families of the murdered French victims Nadine and Jean-Michel uncovers a glaring lapse. 2 fired bullet heads from the Scopetti murders, one lodged in a pillow, one in the sleeping bag, missed for 34 years. DNA testing yields no usable profile. Letters mailed by the killer in 1985 are retested. Examiners isolate something from an unknown male with A-positive blood. But a blood-soaked tissue and 2 surgical gloves return the victim's DNA groups A and 0, but a 1985 notation had reported group B on the handkerchief. If that early typing wasn't a mistake, a third, unaccounted for contributor is implied, and someone on the inside may have been helping to cover it up. And there was another weird thing that happened. Do you remember Mario Spezzi from the beginning of the story, the Florentine journalist who coined the term the Monster of Florence? He was angry after his friend Calamandrei was searched. He teams up with American writer Doug Preston to argue that a Sardinian suspect's son is the monster. And in 2004 and 5, investigators are running taps on them. And they said they detected a plan to plant evidence. In 2006, Spezzi is arrested for obstructing justice and defamation and actually spent 23 days in prison. And then Preston, whose passport was allegedly seized, leaves Italy abruptly. Officially dead since 1989, one of the case's theories, the Sardinia Trail, persists largely through that effort. With leads fading, Giuntari resigns. The case settles into national cold case status. In the 2000s Italian appellate court, all charges are dropped against Spezzi and Preston, and they're cleared of all wrongdoing. But later on, in the past decade or so, Giuntari, who's long retired, still insists that the arrests were made legitimately, and that both of them try to undermine the investigation. Decades later, the outrage has faded, and maybe the scariest possibility isn't a suspect's face, but the thought that someone higher up may have helped dim the lights. Still, some refuse to let it go. There are forums, pages, and researchers still piecing together every testimony, every inconsistency, every name that once mattered. And others, they call what happened absolute evil, something not to be met with revenge, but with testimony. Seek justice for the victims against all odds. Tell the stories of those long gone, and force the record to hold what courts never had a chance to judge. Okay, I'm officially exhausted. I mean, what a crazy case. And it's almost like the more you know about it, the more your head is just spinning. And which story do you believe? Was it a lone sadist stalking the Tuscan hills, or a small crew on the ground making sure there was a supply chain feeding the appetite of something darker, something ritualistic hiding in the shadows? The frontline investigators are gone. Witnesses have died, disappeared, or recanted. And what's left is a justice system tangled in quite conflicts, and institutions seemingly unable or unwilling to cut to the bone of its own case. And do you have any information about this case, heard rumors from Italy or Florence that have never made it into the press, for example? Please share them in the comments, because I'd love to hear them all. When I covered the Fred and Rosemary West case, people from Gloucester filled the comments with personal stories, local whispers, and things only those who lived there knew. And that kind of dialogue, that shared memory, is what keeps these stories alive. And hopefully one day somebody will step forward and it will be able to be solved. But this case is just one of those few cases, just like the Fred and Rosemary West case, that will never die. And if you came here for a clean ending, I need to disappoint you. This case doesn't give one. But if you came for the truth of how a mystery lives, how it keeps breathing through bat searches, rival theory, vanished files, and the stubborn geometry of a ballistic match, then this is it. If you found this case interesting or learned something new, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. Thank you so much for watching another episode of Deep, Dark, and Scary, and I'll see you next time.